Good morning, everyone. We're a bit behind time, so we'll be carrying on with the program. I'd like to request everyone to please rise for the Philippine National Anthem. Please be seated. Good morning, everyone. Magandang umaga po sa inyong lahat. Wassalamualaikum. Indamin walatsu. My name is Red Constantino. I'm from the Institute for Climate and Sustainable Cities, or ICSC. I'll be your host, your moderator for this morning. I'm from an organization that works with governments across the world, with the civil society, and the Climate Vulnerable Forum, particularly, and we provide advisory services across different agencies and advisory support across different member governments of the CVF. The pleasure of being an MC today for this program is that I will be speaking really in a very short portions, because we have a very much packed hall, and speakers that are some of the best representatives of speakers on the issue of climate change today. But before everything else, I'd like to recognize a couple of our distinguished guests. So first of all, welcome to the distinguished members of our diplomatic corps. Welcome po. Thanks for finding time for today. Secretary Ernie Pernia, welcome from the National Economic Development Authority. Secretary Tugade, welcome, sir, from the Department of Transport. Ambassador Bayani Mercado from the Department of Foreign Affairs. Of course, Secretary Manuel de Guzman from the Climate Change Commission. Commissioner Noel Gerlan, Commissioner Bernice Victorio, welcome. Assistant Secretary Ramel Cuenca. Welcome, everyone. Welcome as well. I'd like to recognize our friends, the Honorable Abdullahi Majid, Minister for State for Environment and Energy of the Maldives, which is the founding chair of the CVF. Honorable Silas Melve, Member of Parliament and Parliamentary Secretary for Education of Vanuatu. The Honorable Kare Chawicha Debesa, State Minister for Environment and Climate Change of Ethiopia. Our esteemed guest, and proud to say, considered now a good friend, the Honorable Dr. Shifarao Membacho, Minister for Environment, Forest, and Climate Change of Ethiopia. And of course, the champion of climate change for so long as the issue existed, Senator Lauren Legarda. Welcome everyone. Members of civil society, members of the private sector. Our program today is long, and of course we cannot proceed without recognizing probably one of the most important minds that this country will rely on in the next 6 years to lead us through a very critical period. The Honorable Secretary Alfonso Cusi of the Department of Energy. Welcome, sir. We have a packed program, and as I said, we'd like to get on with the program for the inaugural lectures of the CVF. So to welcome us all and to start off the proceedings, I'd like to ask the request to deliver the welcome remarks for this program, the Vice Chair of the Climate Change Commission, Secretary Emmanuel de Guzman. Sir.
Senate Committee on Climate Change Chair, Senator Lauren Legarda, and the honorable members of the Philippine Senate and the House of Representatives, Cabinet Secretaries Al Cusi of Energy, Arthur Tugade of DOTC, Ernesto Pernia of the NEDA, Ambassador Bayani Mercado of our Foreign Affairs, the incoming chair of the CVF Minister of Environment, Forestry, and Climate Change of Ethiopia, His Excellency Dr. Shifarao Membacho, Parliamentary Secretary Silas Melvi of Vanuatu, fellow members of the CVF Troika Plus and CVF 20, CVF expert advisors and resource speakers, fellow workers in government, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, a warm welcome to all of you. The Climate Vulnerable Forum represents the group of nations most vulnerable to the effects of climate change. Over the past years, we have bravely put a face to the realities of global warming. We have seen the rise in the average deaths and displacements due to climate shocks in our respective countries. Our livelihoods and economic activities have been constantly disrupted by costly recovery and reconstruction efforts. And our people remain at risk as destructive extreme weather events recur and continually ravage our lands. We could have chosen to keep quiet, but we did not. We realized that there was a need for global solidarity to address the problem, so we came together and drew the world's attention to managing climate change risks responsibly and effectively. We have proven that having a collective voice is key to advancing our collective agenda. We have fought tooth and nail to ensure that the Paris Agreement would include the commitment to keep global warming at below 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial averages. And while we have been triumphant in Paris, more work needs to be done to sustain this victory. It is in this regard that the seminar retreat of the CVF was held in the past days. It is an honor for the Philippines to host also today's series of lectures in order for us to learn from one another and to align international and domestic efforts to the 1.5 goal of the Paris Agreement. Moving forward, we need to ensure that our progress will not be derailed by becoming more vocal and visible in the discussions. As CVF, we need to take claim of the role as the lead global advocate in climate change and make our voice matter, because we are, after all, the countries who experience the worst due to its impacts. And as we institutionalize our efforts, may we raise awareness and lobby more people to support our cause. Ladies and gentlemen, this will be the last time I will address you as chair of the CVF. Later on, I will be formally turning over the CVF chairmanship to my colleague, Ethiopian Minister Shifarao Membacho, I have had many conversations with him about the future of CVF, his vision and plans for the group, and I am confident that the Ethiopian presidency will keep our momentum going. His passion and determination, I believe, will take us closer to realizing our shared vision for all. To my colleagues in the CVF, let me also thank you for the opportunity to have served you. Collectively, we have achieved so much these past years, and we will only get stronger and better from here, as long as we continue to draw strengths from one another and remain steadfast in our collective goal. I would like to thank also in advance our distinguished resource speakers for today, Dr. James Fletcher, Dr. Manava Sivakuma, Dr. Salimul Hope, and Mr. Wale Mandan, who will share their knowledge on a wide spectrum of topics such as climate diplomacy, ensuring sustainable development in the agricultural sector despite the impacts of climate change, enhancing South-South cooperation, and strengthening climate action. They will be followed by the climate analytics scientists, Dr. Michael Schaefer and Ms. Jessie Granadillas, to present key findings of the CVF Low Carbon Monitor report. The presentation of the first edition of the Low Carbon Monitor in particular should be enlightening as we work to pursue a low carbon development pathway and a sustainable and climate resilient development for the country, and to reap the benefits of achieving the 1.5 degrees Celsius goal set forth in the Paris Agreement. It is our sincere hope that the knowledge and information shared this morning will provide the impetus for action and pave the way for genuine sustainable development at all levels, and will benefit the present without sacrificing our future. Thank you very much, and we all have an inspiring and meaningful forum.
Maraming salamat, Secretary de Guzman. I'd like to recognize as well a couple of our esteemed friends, champions. Senator Sani Alvarez is here, and Mr. Tito Mitra, Country Director for UNDP. I'm supposed to introduce our next speaker, which is a bit funny because I go to Basilan or Paris or Geneva or New York or Berlin. Everybody knows her because of her work and because her work stands out and has led a lot of movements around the world towards where we want things to be. But let me say a couple of things that are very important as I introduce the next speaker. Two things. As a global leader for tomorrow, she has been named the global leader for tomorrow by the World Economic Forum, a laureate among the Global 500 Roll of Honor of the United Nations Environment Program, and has been appointed as the UNISDR Global Champion for Resilience. In recognition of her commitment to fight against climate change and the promotion of culture and heritage, the French government bestowed upon her the title of Knight in the French National Order of the Legion of Honor. And like I said, any corner of this country knows her name because of her work. Please give a round of applause to the climate change champion in the Senate, Senator Lauren Legarda.
Thank you very much. Maganda umaga po sa inyong lahat. Good morning to all of you on a rainy week before us and a rainy week ahead. But despite that, our visitors and guests from the CVF are present here in the Philippines and had a rainy weekend in Tagaytay, I think. I will not mention again all the names of our guests. We'd just like to welcome you to the Philippines, and I hope that you've tasted some bit of Filipino hospitality. But I would like to make special mention of 3 cabinet members who are here very early this morning, who despite a very long week ahead and spending half the time in Mindanao with a newly elected president, were here in the Philippine Senate. So thank you very much, Secretary Pernia, Secretary Tugade, Secretary Alcusi, for being here today, for supporting the Climate Vulnerable Forum. These 3 gentlemen will bring in or have brought in their expertise and managerial and organization skills in the private sector and in the academe into government. So we're happy to have you in the cabinet of President Duterte. And I am very certain that with Secretary Pernia at the helm of the NEDA, and with Secretary Tugade and his expertise in the private sector, having headed Clark before in transport and communications, a very challenging task lays ahead of you, Secretary Art. And of course, with the expert managerial skills and organization skills of Secretary Alcusi, having come from the private sector as well. These three gentlemen will shepherd the Philippines, hopefully and confidently, into greater heights. And we're grateful that you're here today. Of course, we are grateful that our high-level officials of the CVF member countries are here today. And we would like to acknowledge as well the co-organizer of this event, the Climate Change Commission, Secretary de Guzman, Commissioner Gerlan, Commissioner Victorio, and all the members. The private sector is here too. I will no longer mention each and every one of you. Thank you, UNDP, for organizing this event with us. What really does the future hold for all of us? Nations greatly vulnerable to the ill effects of climate change. We are actually walking on thin ice. Our future is uncertain because we are facing a crisis that we cannot resolve on our own. Sea level rise threatens to submerge island nations, including our very own members of the CVF. And what are these examples? Kiribati, Marshall Islands, and the Maldives. Ocean acidification is causing irreversible damage to our coral reefs, while the sudden shifts from hot temperatures to incessant rains pose uncertainties to agriculture, greatly affecting our food security. The warming climate is now one of the most significant risks for World Heritage sites, including the Philippines, Ifugao rice terraces. Extreme rainfall and heavy flooding constantly threaten lives, livelihood, and sustainable development. And this is why we are not content with the use of the phrase well below 2 degrees Celsius goal when the Paris Agreement was being drafted. Instead, we pushed for the inclusion of the 1.5 degrees global warming limit as our main goal. It was not an easy journey during the Paris Agreement negotiations, yet we continued to move forward through the challenging path of pushing for its ratification. At this point, 22 of the 197 parties to the convention have ratified the agreement, but they only represent 1.08% of global greenhouse gas emissions, or GHG. And this is still too far from the required representation of 55% of GHG emissions for the agreement to take effect. The 2015 Paris Agreement has been hailed by many as a landmark agreement, but its aspirations will not happen on its own. This is where the role of the CVF becomes even more crucial. Allow me first to congratulate the Climate Change Commission, one of the newest agencies of government that was brought about by the enactment of the Climate Change Act in 2009. The CCCOM represented the Philippines in the CVF. It was a challenge for our country to lead the CVF during the very crucial period of crafting and negotiating the Paris Agreement. We could not have done it without the solidarity among the CVF member states and the immense support of the UNDP. And now that Ethiopia will assume the CVF presidency, I am certain that with the unequivocal support of every member, it will continue to steer the CVF towards our common goal of being the voice of reason in the climate negotiations and asserting the rights of vulnerable nations. I think it was very clear in the message of our own President Duterte when he cried for climate justice. And that is the reason why the CVF exists, to push for climate justice, to push for the developed nations to take responsibility for their actions in the past years, if not decades and centuries, and for the vulnerable nations to be able to receive both technical and financial assistance from not just the Climate Fund, but from all of these developed nations, so that we will no longer be vulnerable, so that we can do more, both mitigation and adaptation in our community efforts. Bending the global warming curve to 1.5 degrees Celsius is a moral imperative, especially for the developed nations, because it means saving lives and livelihoods of hundreds of millions of people. It means upholding the human rights of the poor and the vulnerable. It means ensuring the integrity of our ecosystems. Global warming has already breached the 1 degrees Celsius level, with unprecedented warming in the past months. We have already borne the tragedies. We've seen it, whether it was Ondoy in 2009, Sendong in 2011, Pablo in 2012, Haiyan or Yolanda in 2013. And all of these tragedies and losses from recurring impacts of extreme weather events under a 1 degrees Celsius global warming. Now we ask, how much more with higher or warmer temperatures? We actually cannot wait for the agreement to take effect before we take action. We must continue to rally our respective states and communities to take urgent climate action, because global warming will not halt as institutions and nations all over the world debate whether to ratify or not. Although we in the CVF and we in the Philippines are clearly not major emitters in the world, in fact, less than 1 degree Celsius, we cannot let our respective economies grow through the ways that caused today's climate crisis. We cannot let human society live in a world fraught with dangers. Quality of life comes with a price tag, but it is not necessarily beyond our reach. Building livable, or what Red Constantino would say, sustainable cities and communities requires good planning. More importantly, it requires a genuine commitment to the ultimate goal of putting the Earth's and our people's survival foremost over all other concerns. I am glad that we are graced with the presence of our partners in the executive, our cabinet secretaries, whose roles are crucial in the Philippines' journey towards a sustainable, low-carbon economy. Transportation Secretary Arthur Togade, Energy Secretary Al Cusi have both shown commitment and managerial expertise during their previous stints in the private sector, and Secretary Pernia as well. And I am certain they will be our good partners in this endeavor, particularly on energy that is affordable, sustainable, and clean, and on transport that is efficient, reliable, convenient, and inexpensive. I hope our Department of Transport will be open as well to the road sharing scheme, where half the road is allocated to well-designed sidewalks for pedestrians, bike lanes, and urban gardens, and the other half for private vehicles and an organized transport system when applicable. We now enter a new era of development pursuits which challenges us to do more, to do better, to be more innovative. Delivering on our commitments to the Paris Agreement is our way of telling and showing the world that though we are vulnerable, we are not necessarily incapable. We strive for a 1.5 degrees Celsius to thrive. We can do this together. The dream of a safer world needs the cooperation of all countries, of every man, woman, and child. And if we start today, there is no promise that we will be lucky enough to see the undoing of the damage within our lifetime, but at least we leave our world with a gift of hope for a better, kinder future. Congratulations to the CVF. Today, a historic moment as the Philippines turns over the presidency to Ethiopia, whose Minister of Environment and Climate Change is present here today. Thank you. Mabuhay.
Maraming salamat, Senator Ligarda. As always, inspiring. We come now to the inaugural lectures. I don't think we could have assembled a more prestigious lineup of speakers, the leading minds on the subject of climate change, on the subject of action and urgency and ambition. We are in the Philippines, of course, at the cusp of major change promised, committed to by the current administration under President Duterte. I'd like to call for our first speaker, the former Minister of Public Service, Information, Sustainable Development, Energy, Science and Technology in the previous government of San Lucia, currently the Senior Climate Diplomacy Advisor to Climate Analytics, one of the most prestigious think tanks working on climate change in the world, to talk about how small island developing states and vulnerable countries can influence climate change negotiations. Dr. James Fletcher, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Excellencies, distinguished invited guests, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for the honor of this invitation to deliver one of the inaugural lectures of the Philippines Climate Vulnerable Forum South-South Center. It is indeed fitting that we are gathered here in the Philippines for this event, given the very important role this country and its negotiators have played in the international climate change arena over the years. The leadership of the Philippines in the Climate Vulnerable Forum was also very important in directing the CVF to amplify the call going into COP21 in Paris for an ambitious agreement that spoke to 1.5 degrees Celsius as a long-term global temperature goal. Excellencies, I have attended all but one of the conferences of the parties, or the COP as we affectionately refer to them, of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change since the infamous COP15 in Copenhagen in 2009. I attended the last 4 COPs in my capacity as St. Lucia's Minister with responsibility for climate change. Every one of these COPs, with the notable exception of COP21 in Paris last year, had one very striking thing in common for me, and that is a sinking, despairing realization that despite being universally acclaimed as the moral conscience of the climate change negotiations, and the countries most at risk from climate change, small island developing states and climate vulnerable countries were the ones least influential in determining the outcome of the negotiations. It appeared that we were always the ones to compromise, always the ones to accept less than what we deserve, and always the ones to have to return to our respective countries to explain to our bewildered citizens why it was that the countries that had caused the problem were so reluctant to take the requisite decisive action to address what was universally acknowledged as an existential threat to small island developing states and other vulnerable countries. Our ineffectiveness was even more frustrating given the obvious devastating impacts that climate change was having on our countries. In Doha, during my address to the high-level segment of COP18, I sympathized with the residents of Cuba, Haiti, and the eastern seaboard of the United States who had been ravaged by Hurricane Sandy. 1 year later, at the Warsaw COP, I had to express deepest condolences to your government and people who at the time were reeling from the effects of Super Typhoon Yolanda. Little did I know when I was delivering that speech that my own country, St. Lucia, together with our sister island of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, would be visited by an out-of-season weather system less than 1 month later, on Christmas Eve, which left death and destruction in its wake. But the cycle did not end there. At COP20 in Lima, once again, in my address, I had to express solidarity and sympathy to you, our brothers and sisters in the Philippines, after the passage of Typhoon Ruby. And at COP21, my condolences turned to the people of Dominica, who had been devastated by Tropical Storm Erica. It is said that those who fail to learn from history are destined to repeat it. Therefore, if there was one thing that these COPs taught us, was that we could not depend only on science and logic to persuade the recalcitrant that more urgent and meaningful action was required. We had to change our approach if we did not want Paris to be not just another dismal failure of the multilateral negotiating process, but a depressing inflection point in the history of our planet and the lives and livelihoods of citizens of vulnerable countries like ours. The first thing we recognized that we needed to do was to amplify and diversify the voices clamoring for climate action, climate justice. On the 21st of September 2014, a very significant event was organized in New York City and in many cities around the world. Hundreds of thousands of members of civil society in New York, London, Bogota, Berlin, Istanbul, Rio de Janeiro, Lagos, Melbourne, Johannesburg, Paris, and New Delhi marched through the main streets of these cities to call for decisive action to fight climate change. The success of these marches made us realize two things. First of all, that the world was aware of our plight and wanted action to be taken. And secondly, that it was much easier and more effective to get the message across to the wider population when this message was being promoted and distributed by ordinary citizens. Immediately, therefore, in the Caribbean, we devised a plan to enlist the support of civil society in our countries. We formed a partnership with our young people through the Active Caribbean Youth Environment Network. We brought our journalists and media personalities on board, established contact points, and provided them with regularly updated information on the state of the negotiations and the recent findings of the science. We reached out to our artists. The Caribbean has a very rich cultural tradition, and music and storytelling have always played important roles in our societies. So we asked our calypsonians, our reggae musicians, our spoken word artists, our poets, our photographers, our dancers, and our painters to capture and reflect the climate change messages in their own way and help us reach citizens we had not previously been able to. All of this came together in the Caribbean's 1.5 to Stay Alive campaign, a rich, vibrant, and engaging movement that caught the attention and imagination of our Caribbean people on climate change in a matter unachieved in the past. Now it was not just Environment Ministry officials calling for action on climate change, but Caribbean citizens were also demanding that we go to Paris and not return without a strong climate change agreement that reflected all of the issues that were now dear to their hearts. Suddenly, foreign journalists had become more interested in what was happening with the Caribbean delegations and the positions we were taking. And this interest also extended to the other members of the Alliance of Small Island States, or AOSIS, because of the advocacy that had been taking place in the Pacific and in the islands in the Ames region. And that is another area that we changed our approach. Our ministers actively engaged domestic and international media to share with them our concerns and aspirations. As I stated previously, the People's Climate Marches of September 2014 had taught us two important lessons. The first, which I just explained, was the importance of civil society to our cause. The other was that these marches had been successfully staged in many Annex I countries, countries like the United States, the United Kingdom, Germany, Australia, and France. Clearly, therefore, the citizens of these countries were singing a much more supportive tune for climate action than the negotiators who were negotiating on behalf of these state parties. This meant that there was growing internal pressure on many of the Annex I countries to be more sensitive to the plight of climate-vulnerable countries, and we had to find a way to make use of this. Our cause was helped tremendously in June 2015 when Pope Francis released his Laudato Si encyclical, when he called on the world's 1.2 billion Catholics to join the global fight against climate change. Climate-vulnerable countries now had a champion who cut across geographic, political, and social divides. In fact, in the case of this Pope, one can even argue that he cuts across many religious divides. We understood that we needed to start a conversation with some of the countries that had been opposing our climate negotiating red lines to see how we could cause the pendulum of consensus to swing to our side. In this regard, the work of my good friend, the then Foreign Minister of the Marshall Islands, Tony de Bruyn, was critical. In the margins of the first informal ministerial that was co-hosted by COP20 President Manuel Pulgar Vidal, and incoming COP21 President Laura Fabius in Paris in July 2015, Tony convened a meeting of a small coalition of countries interested in securing a successful outcome to the Paris COP. The first meeting was a modest affair, and we spent most of our hour-long engagement discussing what had taken place in the recently concluded Major Economies Forum on Energy and Climate Change. However, Tony de Bruyn persisted, and he pounced on every other opportunity that presented itself, and there were several last year, to convene a meeting of the coalition. We met in New York, and we met in Paris over and over again. At every meeting, our membership grew, and the topics being discussed expanded. Suddenly, Todd Stern, the United States Special Envoy on Climate Change, was asking to meet with the coalition to explore areas of convergence. By the time we arrived in Paris for COP21, the coalition had a place and a purpose. Ironically, it was in a meeting with Todd at the beginning of COP21 to discuss issues related to loss and damage that the term High Ambition Coalition was officially coined and adopted, and the primary focus and objective of the group crystallized, which was to ensure the highest possible ambition in the Paris Agreement. Every meeting of the High Ambition Coalition at COP21 saw new members joining. First, it was the United Kingdom, which allowed the coalition to use its pavilion and its conference room for our meetings. Then it was Canada, Australia, Japan, and eventually the United States, among many others. While no actual negotiating took place in these meetings, we sought as best we could to place all major issues on the table and identify the areas where we believe consensus was possible. Not coincidentally, supportive and positive statements were also being made in the press by parties such as Germany, France, and Australia, which had previously been opposed to the idea of 1.5 degrees Celsius as a long-term temperature goal. The strong position of the Climate Vulnerable Forum on 1.5 degrees Celsius as the long-term temperature goal was very important in helping to build that momentum. Finally, it appeared that climate vulnerable countries were having some success in influencing the tenor of the negotiations. There were two other areas where climate vulnerable countries were able to positively influence the negotiations. As I hinted previously, the French presidency hosted 3 informal ministerial meetings between July and October of last year to bring ministers and senior negotiators from some of the parties together to discuss the areas that were likely to be the most contentious during the COP. At each of these meetings, there were representatives of SIDS, LDCs, the African Group, and ILAC. These meetings gave us opportunities to engage in direct discussions in plenary with our ministerial counterparts from Annex 1 countries, as well as hold bilateral meetings to ventilate many of our concerns. By the time we returned to Paris in December for COP21, we had already developed enough of a relationship with our Annex 1 counterparts that it was relatively easy to engage them in discussions to resolve problematic issues. This was further assisted by the French presidency, when some of us were chosen to be part of a small group of ministerial facilitators charged with achieving consensus among the parties. I was joined on this team by my colleagues from Ecuador, Bolivia, Singapore, Gabon, and the Gambia, which meant that ministers from climate-vulnerable countries were provided an opportunity to work with the COP presidency to articulate the new climate change agreement. We worked with ministerial colleagues from Brazil, Canada, the United Kingdom, Norway, Germany, Sweden, and the United Arab Emirates, Annex 1 and non-Annex 1 parties cooperating to craft the Paris Agreement. The final element I wish to touch on is the issue of preparation. Our countries will always be under-resourced compared to our developed country partners. Annex 1 parties will always have the larger, more specialized delegations. But that should not mean that they have the better prepared negotiators. In fact, my experience has been that our negotiators from our climate vulnerable countries can stand and have stood toe-to-toe with the best of what our Annex 1 partners have to offer. Very often, however, for reasons that I will not recite here today, our ministers and ambassadors are not as prepared as our Annex 1 counterparts. Last year, we sought to address this in the Caribbean. We held 4 meetings in St. Lucia sorry, I just lost my place. We had 4 preparatory meetings over the course of the year in St. Lucia for our negotiators and ministers, during which we dealt in depth with the major issues, discussed the science and the evidence behind our positions, and formulated our negotiating positions. We also had the benefit of excellent technical support from climate analytics and the high-level support mechanism, which significantly augmented the expertise of our technical negotiators. The result was a group of Caribbean ministers and negotiators who were extremely well prepared and working cohesively as one unit, not 14 separate countries, to achieve common outcomes. It was the best we have ever been prepared for a climate change negotiation, and it showed. This should be the modus operandi for climate vulnerable countries at every COP. Excellencies, distinguished invited guests, ladies and gentlemen, I stated in my address to the closing plenary at COP21 that for the first time I was leaving a COP with the feeling that the concerns of small island developing states had been heard and addressed in a COP outcome document. This does not mean that the Paris Agreement is a perfect document. However, it is a historic agreement developed out of a transparent, multilateral negotiating process. And together with the accompanying COP decision, it provides a framework to address all of the issues that we identified as critical to our survival. We fought hard to obtain the Paris Agreement. However, the battle has not been won. There is a long way to go before we can breathe a sigh of relief that our planet, its ecosystem, and our people are no longer in danger. Some of us will not be able to breathe that sigh of relief in our lifetime. There is a saying that, and I quote, "Sometimes leadership is planting trees under whose shade you will never sit." We planted those trees in Paris. Trees that hopefully will shade our planet from the effects of rising global temperatures and provide our children the comfort of a healthier, more hospitable planet. We now have to nurture those trees and give them every possible chance to survive. We, the climate vulnerable countries, must work more closely together, and this South-South Center is a step in the right direction. We must intensify our efforts. We owe it to our children and our planet. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Fletcher. Those among us who were in the room in Paris would have been witness to the fact that in the climate negotiations, what was once a domain largely of developed countries debating and fighting against large emitting developing countries, in Paris this was changed. As Dr. Fletcher has said, where the Philippines allied itself with small island nation states and other vulnerable countries, African countries, and where we said the ants started leading the elephants, producing the voice of the vulnerables and helping produce a successful outcome for Paris. Our next speaker does not require much introduction. I merely have to say that he was the former acting secretary of the IPCC, or the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, Dr. Manava Sivakumar. Thank you.
Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, at the outset, I would like to thank Manny de Guzman for inviting me to make this presentation, and it's a real honor to be here in the Philippine Senate. So, let me start with the first objective of the presentation. Can I have the next slide, please? As you could see here, and as was already mentioned by the previous speakers, climate change today is the single most pressing issue facing the society on a global basis. And I'm going to focus on agriculture, and climate change is actually having an enormous impact on the agriculture performance because it is altering the range and magnitude of the climatic parameters. And this growing awareness of the impacts of climate change on agriculture is forcing policymakers to focus on the sustainability of agriculture production. So in this presentation, what I would like to do is to focus on the impacts of climate change, on the new models of agriculture development, and what steps we need to take to ensure the economic development of the agriculture sector. Next slide, please. And what you see here is the global greenhouse gas emissions growth between 2000 and 2010. And on the x-axis, you see the year from 1970 to 2010. And as you could see here, the bottom one is the carbon dioxide, fossil fuel, and industrial processes. That's the largest emissions. And then you have carbon dioxide also from the land use. And the one above that is the methane, and the one above that is nitrous oxide. And what you notice here is that from 1970 to about 2000, the growth is about 1.3% per year. But the most impact is between 2000 and 2010. In just 10 years, you could see that the greenhouse gas emissions have increased to 2.2% per year. Next slide, please. And the sources of emissions are given here by the IPCC. 35% of the emissions are from the energy sector, 24% from agriculture, forestry, and land use, 21% from industry, 14% from transport, and 6.4% from the building sector. Next slide. And you see here, because of these emissions, the temperature has been increasing enormously. What you notice on the x-axis is from 1850 to 2010, and what you notice here is from about 1850 to about 1950, the temperature increase is not that great. But from 1950 onwards, a little stable. But in the last 3 decades, you see an enormous increase going from about 0.1 degrees to almost now 0.7 degrees. So this is the decadal average, and this shows you the enormous problem that we have today in terms of the land and ocean temperature. Next slide. And most important aspect, especially for countries like ours, which have got large coasts. For example, I come from India. We have a 7,000 kilometer coast, and you also have a big coast in Philippines. And most of the energy that is accumulating in the climate system is absorbed by the ocean. What you notice here is that the light blue is the upper ocean surface, and there you see from about 1980 to until 2012, enormous increase in the energy accumulation in the upper surface of the ocean. And the dark blue underneath is the deep ocean, and that also shows you that there is an enormous increase in the energy accumulation in the deep ocean. In comparison to that, the brown color is the land, and you see that the land is not absorbing a lot of this energy. And so those of our countries that have got coastal areas, we should be very, very much concerned with this aspect, that if the ocean temperature is increasing enormously, it will have a lot of impacts on various issues. Next slide, please. And because of these temperature impacts can have a long-lasting impact on agricultural production, on the crops and forests and arable lands. Next slide, please. So what is it that's happening because of these impacts? What you see here is what is happening in the rich countries, like in North America and Europe and so on. And on the right side, you have the poor nations. Economic losses are higher in rich countries, but what is important is that losses as percentage of GDP in the rich countries is very low. As you could see here, it's only about $100 billion. But in poorest nations, as percentage of GDP, it's going to be more than about 13% of the GDP is going to be affected. And so if that is the case, then poverty is going to increase, and enormous number of impacts on poorest of the poor people in the many vulnerable countries. Next slide, please. So the impacts of climate change on agriculture will continue as it has been in the past, and it will continue in future if we are not able to adapt gas emissions. There are adaptation strategies, but not many countries are adopting these strategies for the farming communities. And so the greenhouse gas emission impacts on agriculture can be high. What we need to do is we have to improve the resilience of agricultural systems to climate change. And there we have to protect the natural resources, whether it is water or soil. And then we have to have more strategies and tools to assist the farming communities. Next slide, please. So here I just listed what are all the effectives and sensitivity by the commodity. You start with corn and soybeans and wheat and rice, cotton, pastures and rangelands, fruit trees and specialty crops. And you see that in all these crops, there are impacts of temperature, impacts of water stress, impacts of extreme events. So these are actually what is causing the reduction in agricultural productivity, and the impacts are on these sectors. Next slide, please. Not only the crops and so on, another important issue is that insect pests, diseases and weeds, these are going to be even more of a problem in future because of the climate change. In insect pests, for example, compared to what it is today, in the future, we could have greater insecticide resistance of these pests. And so there could be increases of the insect pest impacts. There could be also diseases, pathogens from plants and insects and non-crop reservoirs. So the control measures may be less reliable. So we have to really have more research on these insect pests and diseases and weeds as to how we have to deal with these issues in future. Next slide, please. Not only this, I also mentioned to you earlier livestock. If 50 degrees centigrade and so on is affecting us human beings, at least we have a shelter. We can sit inside the room, we can turn on the fan, we can somehow try to manage. But what about livestock? They're out in the open. 50, 52 degrees centigrade, 70, 80% humidity. What is it that livestock, how can they manage to survive this kind of increased temperatures? So the animals are going to have heat and humidity stress that reduces the growth, the reproduction and production, whether it is meat or dairy or eggs. And the climate control costs will increase. And as I mentioned earlier, diseases and pests, they're also going to affect the livestock. Next slide, please. So how can we ensure the economic development of agriculture sector given all these problems? Next slide. So what we need to do is we need to have effective decision making to limit climate change. So we have to evaluate the expected risks and benefits. We have to recognize the importance of governance and also diverse perceptions and responses. Next slide. So this is what is needed.
The Burger King Whopper.
You have to identify the risks. You have to take actions to reduce the risk, and you have to transfer the risk. Under each of those, I have listed the various actions that one needs to take. Because of the lack of time, I'm not going into the details here. But what is important is that for decision making, you need to address all these major issues. Next slide. So here